Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
The Tapestried Chamber by Sir Walter Scott. About the end of the American War, when the officers of Lord Cornwallis's army, which surrendered at Yorktown, and others who had been made prisoners during the impolitic and ill-fated controversy, were returning to their own country to relate their adventures and repose themselves after their fatigues, there was amongst them a general officer of name of Browne. He was an officer of merit, as well as a gentleman of high consideration for family entertainments. Some business had carried General Browne upon a tour through the western counties, when, in the conclusion of a morning stage, he found himself in the vicinity of a small country town, which presented a scene of uncommon beauty and of a character peculiarly English. The little town, with its stately old church, whose tower bore testimony to the devotion of ages long past, lay amidst pasture and cornfields of small extent, but bounded and divided with hedgerow of timber of great age and size. There were few marks of modern improvement. The environs of the place intimated neither the solitude of decay nor the bustle of novelty. The houses were old, but in good repair, and the beautiful little river murmured freely on its way to the left of the town, neither restrained by a dam nor bordered by a towing path. Upon a gentle eminence, nearly a mile to the southward of the town, was seen amongst many venerable oaks and tangled thickets the turrets of a castle, as old as the wars of York and Lancaster, but which seemed to have received important alterations during the age of Elizabeth and her successors. It had not been a place of great size, but whatever accommodation it formerly afforded was, it must be supposed, still to be obtained within its walls. At least such was the inference which General Browne drew from observing the smoke arise merrily from several of the ancient wreathed and carved chimney-stalks. The wall of the park ran alongside of the highway for 200 or 300 yards, and through the different points by which the eye found glimpses into the woodland scenery, it seemed to be well stocked. Other points of view opened in succession, now a full one of the front of the old castle, and now a side glimpse at its particular towers, the former rich in all the bizarrerie of the Elizabethan school, while the simple and solid strength of other parts of the building seemed to show that they had been raised more for defence than ostentation. Delighted with the partial glimpses which he obtained of the castle through the woods and glades by which this ancient feudal fortress was surrounded, our military traveller was determined to inquire whether it might not deserve a nearer view, and whether it contained family pictures or other objects of curiosity worthy of a stranger's visit, when, leaving the vicinity of the park, he rode through a clean and well-paved street, and stopped at the door of a well-frequented inn. Before ordering horses to proceed on his journey, General Browne made inquiries concerning the proprietor of the chateau which had so attracted his admiration, and was equally surprised and pleased at hearing in reply a nobleman named, who we shall call Lord Woodville. How fortunate! Much of Browne's early recollections, both at school and at college, had been connected with young Woodville, whom, by a few questions, he now ascertained to be the same with the owner of this fair domain. He had been raised to the peerage by the decease of his father a few months before, and, as the General learned from the landlord, the term of mourning being ended, was now taking possession of his paternal estate in the jovial season of merry autumn, accompanied by a select party of friends to enjoy the sports of a country famous for game. This was delightful news to our traveller. Frank Woodville had been Richard Browne's fag at Eton, and his chosen intimate at Christ Church. Their pleasures and their risks had been the same, and the honest soldier's heart warmed to find his early friend in possession of so delightful a residence, and of an estate, as the landlord assured him with a nod and a wink, fully adequate to maintain and add to his dignity. Nothing was more natural than that the traveller should suspend a journey, which there was nothing to render hurried, to pay a visit to an old friend under such agreeable circumstances. The fresh horses, therefore, had only the brief task of conveying the General's travelling carriage to Woodville Castle. A porter admitted them at a modern Gothic lodge, built in that style to correspond with the castle itself, and at the same time rang a bell to give warning of the approach of visitors. Apparently the sound of the bell had suspended the separation of the company bent on the various amusements of the morning, for, on entering the court of the chateau, several young men were lounging about in their sporting dresses, looking at and criticising the dogs which the keepers held in readiness to attend their pastime. As General Browne alighted, the young lord came to the gate of the hall, and for an instant gazed as at a stranger upon the countenance of his friend, on which war, with its fatigues and its wounds, had made a great alteration. But the uncertainty lasted no longer than till the visitor had spoken, and the hearty greeting which followed was such as can only be exchanged betwixt those who have passed together merry days of careless boyhood or early youth. "If I could have formed a wish, my dear Browne," said Lord Woodville, "it would have been to have you here of all men upon this occasion, which my friends are good enough to hold as a sort of holiday. Do not think you have been unwatched during the years you have been absent from us. I have traced you through your dangers, your triumphs, your misfortunes, and was delighted to see that, whether in victory or defeat, the name of my old friend was always distinguished with applause." The General made a suitable reply and congratulated his friend on his new dignities and the possession of a place and domain so beautiful. "Nay, you have seen nothing of it as yet," said Lord Woodville, "and I trust you do not mean to leave us till you are better acquainted with it. It is true, I confess, that my present party is pretty large, and the old house, like other places of the kind, does not possess so much accommodation as the extent of the outward walls appears to promise. But we can give you a comfortable, old-fashioned room, and I venture to suppose that your campaigns have taught you to be glad of worse quarters." The General shrugged his shoulders and laughed. I presume," he said, "the worst apartment in your chateau is considerably superior to the old tobacco cask in which I was fain to take up my night's lodgings when I was in the bush, as the Virginians call it, with the light corps. There I lay, like Diogenes himself, so delighted with my covering from the elements that I made a vain attempt to have it rolled on to my next quarters. But my commander for the time would give way to no such luxurious provision, and I took farewell of my beloved cask with tears in my eyes." "Well, then, since you do not fear your quarters," said Lord Woodville, "you will stay with me a week at least. Of guns, dogs, fishing rods, flies, and means of sport by sea and land, we have enough and to spare. You cannot pitch on an amusement, but we will pitch on you the means of pursuing it. But if you prefer the gun and the pointers, I will go with you myself, and see whether you have mended your shooting since you have been among the Indians of the back settlements." The General gladly accepted his friendly host's proposal in all its points. After a morning of manly exercise, the company met at dinner, where it was the delight of Lord Woodville to conduce to the display of the high properties of his recovered friend, so as to recommend him to his guests, most of whom were persons of distinction. He led General Browne to speak of the scenes he had witnessed, and as every word marked alike the brave officer and the sensible man who retained possession of his cool judgment under the most imminent dangers, the company looked upon the soldier with great respect, as on one who had proved himself possessed of an uncommon portion of personal courage, that attribute, of all others, of which everybody desires to be thought possessed. The day at Woodville Castle ended as usual in such mansions. The hospitality stopped within the limits of good order. Music, in which the young lord was a proficient, succeeded to the circulation of the bottle, cards, and billiards, for those who preferred such amusements were in readiness. But the exercise of the morning required early hours, and not long after 11 o'clock the guests began to retire to their several apartments. The young lord himself conducted his friend General Browne to the chamber destined for him, which answered the description he had given of it, being comfortable but old-fashioned. The bed was of the massive form used in the end of the 17th century, and the curtains of faded silk, heavily trimmed with tarnished gold. But then the sheets, pillows and blankets looked delightful to the campaigner when he thought of his mansion, the cask. There was an air of gloom in the tapestry hangings, which, with their worn-out graces, curtained the walls of the little chamber and gently undulated as the autumnal breeze found its way through the ancient lattice window, which pattered and whistled as the air gained entrance. The toilet, too, with its mirror, turbaned after the manner of the beginning of the century, with a coiffure of murrey-coloured silk, and its 100 strange-shaped boxes providing for arrangements which had been obsolete for more than 50 years, had an antique and, insofar, a melancholy aspect. But nothing could blaze more brightly and cheerfully than the 2 large wax candles, or if aught could rival them, it was the flaming, bickering faggots in the chimney that sent at once their gleam and their warmth through the snug apartment, which, notwithstanding the general antiquity of its appearance, was not wanting in the least convenience that modern habits rendered either necessary or desirable. "This is an old-fashioned sleeping apartment, General," said the young lord, "but I hope you will find nothing that makes you envy your old tobacco cask." "I am not particular respecting my lodgings," replied the General, "yet were I to make any choice, I would prefer this chamber by many degrees to the gayer and more modern rooms of your family mansion. Believe me that when I unite its modern air of comfort with its venerable antiquity, and recollect that it is your lordship's property, I shall feel in better quarters here than if I were in the best hotel London could afford. I trust, I have no doubt, that you will find yourself as comfortable as I wish you, my dear General," said the young nobleman, and once more bidding his guest good night, he shook him by the hand and withdrew. The General again looked around him, and internally congratulating himself on his return to peaceful life, the comforts of which were endeared by the recollection of the hardships and dangers he had lately sustained, undressed himself and prepared himself for a luxurious night's rest. Here, contrary to the custom of this species of tale, we leave the General in possession of his apartment until the next morning. The company assembled for breakfast in an early hour, but without the appearance of General Browne, who seemed the guest that Lord Woodville was desirous of honouring above all whom his hospitality had assembled around him. He more than once expressed a surprise at the General's absence, and at length sent a servant to make inquiry after him. The man brought back information that General Browne had been walking abroad since an early hour of the morning, in defiance of the weather, which was misty and ungenial. "The custom of a soldier," said the young nobleman to his friends. "Many of them acquire habitual vigilance and cannot sleep after the early hour at which their duty usually commands them to be alert." Yet the explanation which Lord Woodville thus offered to the company seemed hardly satisfactory to his own mind, and it was in a fit of silence and abstraction that he awaited the return of the General. It took place nearly an hour after the breakfast bell had rung. He looked fatigued and feverish. His hair, the powdering and arrangement of which was at this time one of the most important occupations of a man's whole day, and marked his fashion as much as, in the present time, the tying of a cravat, or the want of one, was dishevelled, uncurled, void of powder, and dank with dew. His clothes were huddled on with a careless negligence remarkable in a military man, whose real or supposed duties are usually held to include some attention to the toilet, and his looks were haggard and ghastly in a peculiar degree. "So you have stolen a march upon us this morning, my dear General," said Lord Woodville, "or you have not found your bed so much to your mind as I had hoped and you seemed to expect. How did you rest last night?" "Oh, excellently well, remarkably well, never better in my life," said General Browne rapidly, and yet with an air of embarrassment which was obvious to his friend. He then hastily swallowed a cup of tea, and neglecting or refusing whatever else was offered, seemed to fall into a fit of abstraction. "You will take the gun today, General?" said his friend and host. but had to repeat the question twice ere he received the abrupt answer. "No, my lord, I'm sorry. I cannot have the honour of spending another day with your lordship. My post-horses are ordered and will be here directly." All who were present showed surprise, and Lord Woodville immediately replied, "Post-horses, my good friend? What can you possibly want with them, when you promised to stay with me quietly for at least a week?" I believe," said the General, obviously much embarrassed, "that I might, in the pleasure of my first meeting with your lordship, have said something about stopping here a few days, but I have since found it altogether impossible." "That is very extraordinary," answered the young nobleman. "You seem quite disengaged today, and you cannot have had a summons today, for our post has not come up from town, and therefore you cannot have received any letters." General Browne, without giving any further explanation, muttered something about indispensable business, and insisted on the absolute necessity of his departure in a manner which silenced all opposition on the part of his host, who saw that his resolution was taken and forbore further importunity. "At least, however," he said, "permit me, my dear Browne, since you will or must, to show you the view from the terrace, which the mist that is now rising will soon display." He threw open a sash window and stepped down upon the terrace as he spoke. The General followed him mechanically, but seemed little to attend to what his host was saying, as, looking across an extended and rich prospect, he pointed out the different objects worthy of observation. Thus they moved on, till Lord Woodville had attained his purpose of drawing his guest entirely apart from the rest of the company, when, turning round upon him with an air of great solemnity, he addressed him thus: "Richard Browne, my old and very dear friend, we are now alone. Let me conjure you to answer me upon the word of a friend and the honour of a soldier. How did you in reality rest during last night?" "Most wretchedly indeed, my lord," answered the General in the same tone of solemnity, "so miserably that I would not run the risk of such a second night, not only for all the lands belonging to this castle, but for all the country which I see from this elevated point of view." "This is most extraordinary," said the young lord, as if speaking to himself. "Then there must be something in the reports concerning that apartment." Again turning to the General, he said, "For God's sake, my dear friend, be candid with me, and let me know the disagreeable particulars which have befallen you under a roof where, with the consent of the owner, you should have met nothing save comfort." The General seemed distressed by this appeal, and paused a moment before he replied. "My dear lord," he at length said, "what happened to me last night is of nature so peculiar and so unpleasant that I could hardly bring myself to detail it even to your lordship, were it not that, independent of my wish to gratify any request of yours, I think that sincerity on my part may lead to some explanation about a circumstance equally painful and mysterious. To others, the communications I am about to make might place me in the light of a weak-minded, superstitious fool who suffered his own imagination to delude and bewilder him. But you have known me in childhood and youth, and will not suspect me of having adopted in manhood the feelings and frailties from which my early years were free." Here he paused, and his friend replied, "Do not doubt my perfect confidence in the truth of your communication, however strange it may be," replied Lord Woodville. "I know your firmness of disposition too well to suspect you could be made the object of imposition, and am aware that your honour and your friendship will equally deter you from exaggerating whatever you may have witnessed." "Well then," said the General, "I will proceed with my story as well as I can, relying upon your candour, and yet distinctly feeling that I would rather face a battery than recall to my mind the odious recollections of last night." He paused a second time, and then, perceiving that Lord Woodville remained silent and in an attitude of attention, he commenced, though not without obvious reluctance, the history of his night's adventures in the Tapestried Chamber. I undressed and went to bed so soon as your lordship left me yesterday evening, but the wood in the chimney, which nearly fronted my bed, blazed brightly and cheerfully, and, aided by 100 exciting recollections of my childhood and youth, which had been recalled by the unexpected pleasure of meeting your lordship, prevented me from falling asleep immediately. I ought, however, to say that these reflections were all of a pleasant and agreeable kind, grounded on the sense of my having for a time exchanged the labour, fatigues, and dangers of my profession for the enjoyments of a peaceful life, and the reunion of those friendly and affectionate ties which I had torn asunder at the rude summons of war. While such pleasing reflections were stealing over my mind and gradually lulling me to slumber, I was suddenly aroused by a sound like that of the rustling of a silken gown and the tapping of a pair of high-heeled shoes, as if a woman were walking in the apartment. Ere I could draw the curtain to see what the matter was, the figure of a little woman passed between the bed and the fire. The back of this form was turned to me, and I could observe, from the shoulders and neck, it was that of an old woman, whose dress was an old-fashioned gown, which I think ladies call a sack, that is, a sort of robe, completely loose in the body, but gathered round into broad plaits upon the neck and shoulders, which fall down to the ground and terminate in a species of train. I thought the intrusion singular enough, but never harboured for a moment the idea that what I saw was anything more than the mortal form of some old woman about the establishment, who had a fancy to dress like her grandmother, and who, having perhaps, as your lordship mentioned that you were rather straitened for room, been dislodged from her chamber for my accommodation, had forgotten the circumstance and returned by 12 to her old haunt. Under this persuasion, I moved myself in bed and coughed a little to make the intruder sensible of my being in possession of the premises. She turned slowly round. But gracious heaven, my lord, what a countenance did she display to me! There was no longer any question what she was, or any thought of her being a living being. Upon a face which wore the fixed features of a corpse were imprinted the traces of the vilest and most hideous passions which had animated her while she lived. The body of some atrocious criminal seemed to have been given up from the grave, and the soul restored from the penal fire, in order to form for a space a union with the ancient accomplice of its guilt. I started up in bed and sat upright, supporting myself on my palms as I gazed on this horrible spectre. The hag made, as it seemed, a single and swift stride to the bed where I lay, and squatted herself down upon it, in precisely the same attitude which I had assumed in the extremity of horror, advancing her diabolical countenance within half a yard of mine with a grin which seemed to indicate the malice and the derision of an incarnate fiend. Here General Browne stopped and wiped from his brow the cold perspiration with which the recollection of this horrible vision had covered it. "My lord," he said, "I am no coward. I have been in all the mortal dangers incidental to my profession, and I may truly boast that no man ever knew Richard Browne dishonour the sword he wears, but in these horrible circumstances, under the eyes and, as it seemed, almost in the grasp of an incarnation of an evil spirit, all firmness forsook me, all manhood melted from me like wax in the furnace, and I felt my hair individually bristle. The current of my lifeblood ceased to flow, and I sank back in a swoon, as very a victim to panic terror as ever was a village girl or a child of 10 years old. How long I lay in this condition I cannot pretend to guess, but I was aroused by the castle clock striking 1 so loud that it seemed as if it were in this very room. It was some time before I dared open my eyes, lest they again should encounter the horrible spectacle. When, however, I summoned courage to look up, she was no longer visible. My first idea was to pull my bell, to wake the servants, and remove to a garret or a hayloft to be insured against a second visitation. Nay, I will confess the truth, that my resolution was altered, not by the shame of exposing myself, but by the very fear that, as the bell cord hung by the chimney, I might, in making my way to it, be again crossed by the fiendish hag, who, I figured to myself, might still be lurking about some corner of the apartment. I will not pretend to describe what hot and cold fever fits tormented me for the rest of the night, through broken sleep, weary vigils, and that dubious state which forms the neutral ground between them. 100 terrible objects appeared to haunt me, but there was the great difference betwixt the vision which I have described and those which followed, that I knew the last to be deceptions of my own fancy and overexcited nerves. Day at last appeared, and I rose from my bed ill in health and humiliated in mind. I was ashamed of myself as a man and a soldier, and still more so at feeling my own extreme desire to escape from the haunted apartment, which, however, conquered all other considerations, so that, huddling on my clothes with the most careless haste, I made my escape from your lordship's mansion, to seek in the open air some relief to my nervous system, shaken as it was by this horrible re-encounter with a visitant, for such I must believe her, from the other world. Your lordship has now heard the cause of my discomposure, and of my sudden desire to leave your hospitable castle. In other places I trust we may often meet, but God protect me from ever spending a second night under that roof." Strange as the General's tale was, he spoke with such a deep air of conviction that it cut short all the usual commentaries which are made on such stories. Lord Woodville never once asked him if he was sure he did not dream of the apparition, or suggested any of the possibilities by which it is fashionable to explain supernatural appearances, as wild vagaries of the fancy or deceptions of the optic nerves. On the contrary, he seemed deeply impressed with the truth and reality of what he'd heard, and, after a considerable pause, regretted with much appearance of sincerity that his early friend should in his house have suffered so severely. "I'm the more sorry for your pain, my dear Browne," he continued, "that it is the unhappy, though most unexpected, result of an experiment of my own. You must know that for my father and grandfather's time, at least, the apartment which was assigned to you last night had been shut on account of reports that it was disturbed by supernatural sights and noises. When I came, a few weeks since, into possession of the estate, I thought the accommodation which the castle afforded for my friends was not extensive enough to permit the inhabitants of the invisible world to retain possession of a comfortable sleeping apartment. I therefore caused the Tapestried Chamber, as we call it, to be opened, and without destroying its air of antiquity, I had such new articles of furniture placed in it as became the modern times. Yet, as the opinion that the room was haunted very strongly prevailed among the domestics, and was also known in the neighbourhood and to many of my friends, I feared some prejudice might be entertained by the first occupant of the Tapestried Chamber, which might tend to revive the evil report which it had laboured under, and so disappoint my purpose of rendering it a useful part of the house. I must confess, my dear Browne, that your arrival yesterday, agreeable to me for 1,000 reasons besides, seemed the most favourable opportunity of removing the unpleasant rumours which attached to the room, since your courage was indubitable, and your mind free of any preoccupation on the subject. I could not, therefore, have chosen a more fitting subject for my experiment. "Upon my life," said General Browne, somewhat hastily, "I'm infinitely obliged to your lordship, very particularly indebted indeed. I'm likely to remember for some time the consequences of the experiment, as your lordship is pleased to call it." "Nay, now you're unjust, my dear friend," said Lord Woodville. "You have only to reflect for a single moment in order to be convinced that I could not augur the possibility of the pain to which you have been so unhappily exposed. I was yesterday morning a complete sceptic on the subject of supernatural appearances. Nay, I am sure that had I told you what was said about that room, those very reports would have induced you by your own choice to select it for your accommodation. It was my misfortune, perhaps my error, but really it cannot be termed my fault, that you have been afflicted so strangely. "Strangely indeed," said the General, resuming his good temper, "and I acknowledge that I have no right to be offended with your lordship for treating me like what I used to think myself, a man of some firmness and courage. But I see my post-horses are arrived, and I must not detain your lordship from your amusement." "Nay, my old friend," said Lord Woodville, "since you cannot stay with us another day, which indeed I can no longer urge, give me at least half an hour more. I used to love pictures, and I have a gallery of portraits, some of them by Van Dyck, representing ancestry to whom this property and castle formerly belonged. I think that several of them will strike you as possessing merit." General Browne accepted the invitation, though somewhat unwillingly. It was evident he was not to breathe freely or at ease until he left Woodville Castle far behind him. He couldn't refuse his friend's invitation, however, and the less so that he was a little ashamed of the peevishness which he displayed towards his well-meaning entertainer. The General therefore followed Lord Woodville through several rooms into a long gallery hung with pictures, which the latter pointed out to his guest, telling the names and giving some account of the personages whose portraits presented themselves in progression. General Browne was but little interested in the details which these accounts conveyed to him. They were indeed of the kind which are usually found in the old family gallery. Here was a cavalier who had ruined the estate in the royal cause, there a fine lady who had reinstated it by contracting a match with a wealthy Roundhead. There hung a gallant who had been in danger for corresponding with the exiled court of Saint-Germain. Here one who had taken arms for William at the Revolution, and there a third who had thrown his weight alternately into the scale of Whig and Tory. While Lord Woodville was cramming these words into his guest's ear against the stomach of his sense, they gained the middle of the gallery, when he beheld General Browne suddenly start and assume an attitude of the utmost surprise, not unmixed with fear, as his eyes were caught and suddenly riveted by a portrait of an old lady in a sack, the fashionable dress of the end of the 17th century. "There she is," he exclaimed. "There she is, in form and features, though inferior in demoniac expression to the accursed hag who visited me last night." "If that be the case," said the young nobleman, "there can remain no longer any doubt of the horrible reality of your apparition. That is the picture of a wretched ancestor of mine, whose crimes a black and fearful catalogue is recorded in the family history in my charter chest. The recital of them would be too horrible. It's enough to say that in yon fatal apartment incest and unnatural murder were committed. I will restore it to the solitude to which the better judgment of those who preceded me had consigned it, and never shall anyone, so long as I can prevent it, be exposed to a repetition of the supernatural horrors which could shake such courage as yours." Thus the friends who had met with such glee parted in a very different mood. Lord Woodville to command the Tapestried Chamber to be unmantled and the door built up, and General Browne to seek in some less beautiful country and with some less dignified friend forgetfulness of the painful night which he had passed in Woodville Castle. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. So that was The Tapestried Chamber by Walter Scott, later Sir Walter Scott. Well, I say he was born Walter, but became Sir Walter. It's not later than now, if you understand what I mean. That story was published in 1829. We'll come to the story. It's quite an early one then for most of the things that we do. Most of the stuff we do tends to be late Victorian, Edwardian, but this is a bit earlier, and I think that's relevant, and I will discuss it. So Walter Scott, was born in Edinburgh on 15th August 1771, and he died at Abbotsford in the Scottish borders in 1832. So in his youth he had polio, which made him lame, and he was sent to live with relatives in the borders, and he became very enamoured with the whole borders culture, the speech, that the Scots, the version of Scots, which potentially you may argue is the purest Scots or the most Scottish Scots, but the Scots can argue about that. It's quite hard to understand border Scots, actually. I was once at a wedding in Castle Douglas, and it was loud, and I was talking to this guy, and I'm usually pretty good with Scottish accents, but I actually couldn't understand what he was saying. I was just nodding. Also I'm a bit deaf, so it didn't help. So he went there, and he was educated at Edinburgh and trained as an advocate. He balanced his legal career with a rising literary ambition, publishing translations of German ballads in the 1790s and compiling Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border 1802-1803. And this brought him his first major literary success. He was a poet to begin with, and so The Lay of the Last Minstrel, 1805, Marmion, which was a big one, 1808, The Lady of the Lake, 1810. So he was a leading poet of the Romantic period, the leading poet until he was eclipsed by Lord Byron in 1812. Perhaps because of this, because, I think one thing that comes up when you think about Scott or learning about Scott is that he had a commercial head on. I mean, he was a lawyer. He wasn't born into, the idle aristocracy. He worked for a living. And so he always had an eye, I think, to the commercial side of what he was doing. So poetry, let's write some novels. So, however, he published Waverley, his big beast, in 1814, and it was a historical novel, which it actually inaugurated the historical novel as a dominant literary form in Europe. He was massively influential, Walter Scott, and so for the next 2 decades he produced Rob Roy, Old Mortality, Heart of Midlothian, and Ivanhoe, and these were about the sense of historical change with vivid storytelling, I think. Perhaps also some moral aspect to it, because it was expected that literary works couldn't just be, and this is another thing we'll come to as we're discussing this, but couldn't just be entertainments. I mean, I think we even had that to these days, don't we? Where we perhaps accept that a novel can be entertaining, as it was intended to be, but literary fiction is also intended to be improving. So we still have that, whereas sort of your detective stories, your crime stories, your science fiction, your fantasy, they're not really expected to be improving, are they? But literary works are supposed to, I think, leave you with some kind of enhanced understanding of the human condition, even today. And this was prevalent then, this tension between, novels as being vapid, empty-headed nonsense, and poets who were saying something important, and then literary fiction deriving perhaps from, well, in one of its origins is this idea of the morally uplifting nature of poetry, So anyway, I've kind of egged that a bit. So he was publishing anonymously, but he became known as the author of Waverley. In his personal life, he was deeply embedded in Edinburgh's Tory establishment. So the Tories are a conservative movement. They're a conservative party, but I mean, it's a wider thing than that. So it's they typically support hierarchies, social networks, the established order, the monarchy. In England, particularly the Anglican Church, which is the Episcopal Church, the official church set up by Henry VIII. In Scotland, of course, the Church of Scotland is a proper Protestant church. It's a Presbyterian church rather than the Church of England, which hasn't quite decided whether it's a Catholic church or a Protestant church. But the Tories particularly support the way things were. So, and they're very attached to the way things were, that the past was better, and that the lessons it sends us about order, responsibility, people knowing their place and serving a role within that structure. And of course their political project is to maintain this through continuity in law and culture. Of course, what you've got is, okay, he's slightly older, but you've had the French Revolution and then the American Revolution, which have challenged this, and so it was this movement is saying no, we don't want this this radical. Look at the trouble it's caused in the world. It's interesting. This story is set in the aftermath of the American War, anyway, so this is him. He was a sheriff depute of Selkirkshire and clerk of sessions, was made a baronet in 1820, so he's a very establishment figure. He constructed at Abbotsford a neo-Gothic mansion which you can visit with antiquarian treasures, so not just things that were old because they date from his life, but things were old even then, and he venerated, that conservative worldview is to venerate the things that have come down to us from the past. But this he's a massively interesting character because, he has this deeply conservative part, which is to say that, simply put, the past is best, let's preserve it. That's conservatism, isn't it? But this man's massively creative, and not only does he preserve the past, he actually recreates the past. So we think of Rob Roy and Ivanhoe, but particularly the Scottish past. This whole Queen Victoria was fond of him, I think, and the aristocracy, because I suppose he would support them. But so this whole romanticised idea, we've had the 1745 Jacobite rebellion and the banning of the wearing of tartan, people coming down heavily on the Gaelic language and a whole Gaelic culture, or Erse as they would call it, the Irish culture. This is a whole different debate, the continuity of Gaelic culture across Ireland and Scotland, which of course I'm a believer in. I don't believe there are separate Gaelic languages. I think that they are dialects of the same language, and nationalists, both Irish and Scottish, may disagree with me, but the Gael are the Gael, in my view. The sea-divided Gael, as Miles Nagopolian calls them. But anyway, Scott, who was not a Gael, he was a borderer, really, he invented this whole mysterious, romantic Highland thing with tartans. He's behind this whole business. The whole of the Scottish Tourist Board is paid for by Sir Walter Scott, pretty much. I am not sure if he invented shortbread, but I'm sure that the popularity of Walker's shortbread, of which I have Johnny Walker's whiskey, again not related to either of those. Johnny Walker, not Johnny Walker's crisps, not them either. But I love shortbread. I think it's genetic, to be honest. So there you've got your tin of Walker's shortbread, and they've got the tartan, and they've got the Highland View, potentially Edinburgh Castle, to be fair, or Ellen Donnan or somewhere like that. And it's him. He did it. But there's other interesting things to say about him. So he was massively successful. And he entered into a close partnership with James Ballantyne, Ballantyne, still a publishing house. He was Walter Scott's friend, became a printer, and they created a publishing and printing firm. So the early 19th century, it got entangled with the ambitious house of Archibald Constable and Co. Then there was a banking crisis. Who'd have believed there could have been a banking crisis in 1825, and the chain of credit on which much of the publishing world depended collapsed. So Constable and Co. went bankrupt in January 1826. So he's only got 6 years to live. Yeah, he doesn't know this at the time, bringing down the Ballantyne press with it. So he had personal financial liability, the only partner, and he had a debt exceeding £130,000, which is equivalent to millions and millions of pounds today. So he could have declared bankruptcy. He would have lost his honour, certainly, because it's a dishonourable thing to declare bankrupt, and perhaps his estate. So he decided he was going to write his way out of it. He was going to repay the whole sum through his writing. "My own right hand shall do it," he wrote. So he put his house and all his copyrights to a trust controlled by his creditors. So they're the people he owes money to. And he works like a Trojan. And in 6 years that followed, despite declining health and the recent death of his wife, he produced 6 novels, 2 plays, a biography of Napoleon Bonaparte, and several volumes of history and essays, and this story, the Tapestried Chamber. He also began a private journal published posthumously. and reveals the toll that these efforts took on his mind and body. Basically killed him, you know. He worked day after day to exhaustion, refusing to rest until the debt was paid. You have got to have some admiration for the spirit of the man. I've got a lot of admiration for him, in fact. His Life of Napoleon, 1827, though criticised for its length and lack of impartiality, was a commercial success and contributed significantly to reducing the debt. I'm cheering him on all the time. His Tales of a Grandfather, a retelling of Scottish history for children, was published in multiple volumes and became one of his most beloved late works. So he's heroic, really. What integrity, what grit he had. And he didn't actually live to see the debt fully cleared, but after he died, his novels continued to be successful, and it was paid off, you know. So basically, he killed himself because of his honour. So let's think about his influence. He popularised the historical novel. He shaped the European romantic imagination, inspired writers in Russia, Pushkin, France, Balzac, Italy, Manzoni, Tolstoy. He played a crucial role in He played a crucial role in rehabilitating the image of Highland culture after the 1745 Jacobite rebellion, culminating in his orchestration of King George IV's 1822 visit to Scotland. So there we have it. It may be, maybe considered a betrayal of the Jacobite cause that he's in with the Hanoverians. I mean, if you go particularly to Edinburgh, the heavy hand of the Hanoverians is on George Street. Let's face it, it feels Hanoverian, you know. It's got layers and layers of histories, obviously, but there is a big Hanoverian thing. So they made their mark there, and he may have been part of that. Let's think about the Gothic tradition. He's less often grouped with Gothic writers like Radcliffe and Lewis, you know, the monk and all that kind of stuff, Mysteries of Udolpho, etc. He engaged deeply with Gothic themes, even though he was a bit sneery about the Gothic. I think this is a guy who is, clearly because of what he did to himself, he's actually concerned with his sense of honour and prestige and how other people think of him. And so the Gothic, we've talked about this many times, was the schlock. It was looked down upon. The Gothic writers themselves attempted to elevate its status by taking Edmund Burke's view of the sublime and saying, "Oh, that's what we're doing, really." And there is an argument to be made there, to be fair, but it was considered lowbrow. So he didn't want to be totally. This is what I'm saying about his commercial sense as well. He didn't want to be totally identified with the Gothic, and he was quite scathing in some cases, and kept himself at arm's length. But his work is full of Gothic stuff, you know. I mean, The Bride of Lammermoor, The Monastery, The Abbot combine historical realism, which was obviously a big thing for him, with elements of the supernatural, spectral guilt, and ancestral decay. He collaborated quite early on in 1801 with Matthew Lewis, monk Lewis, in Tales of Wonder, and his role in shaping the Border ballad tradition first firmly embedded Scott in the Gothic literary culture of his time, full of ruined castles, tragic destinies, fatalistic ironies. But of course, the other side of things is the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly in the 18th century, mid to late 18th century, was a massively important thing and very influential in the world. Adam Smith and all that gang, you know, and the philosophy stuff that came out of it as well. Skeptical Enlightenment view. Anyway, however, so I think he, like most of us, so what we're seeing is a man who's deeply conservative, but is quite up to and believes in almost the sacredness of the past and truth. However, he's quite up to making stuff up as well, or at least taking what was and putting a polish of his own, an imaginative polish on it. So, you know, he is conservative, but he's also innovative. He's also creative as well. It's not just about keeping things as they were, it's remaking them. And, you know, he doesn't think much of the Gothic. Yeah, he's quite happy to use it. He is as we'll see, an Enlightenment thinker, Scottish Enlightenment thinker in lots of ways, but he's got this very romantic side to him as well. So, but I would say, I don't know if you've heard of cognitive dissonance, but it's the ability to hold two contrary facts at the same time. And, you can believe two things that completely contradict each other in the rational world, but you can believe them both. People do it all the time. I do it, certainly. Anyway, I'm just going to say in 1793, he visited Glamis Castle. And this is a man who doesn't believe in ghosts. And he actually, when he was there, he drank from the famous Lion of Glamis, from this big cup, magnificent silver cup crafted by Elias Zor of Augsburg in the early 1600s. The leonine form echoing the lion family name, and it is called the Poculum Potatorium, the cup of drinks, genitive plural. This inspires the Baron of Bredwardines in Waverley, his drink thing, his cup, the drinking vessel. I'm making a pig's ear of this, aren't I? Anyway, so he uses this. But when he was at Glamis Castle, which is famously haunted, he talks about, he writes in his notes, as I heard door after door shut, I began to consider myself as too far away from the living and somewhat too near the dead. So this is a guy who doesn't believe in ghosts, but kind of does a little bit as well. Aren't we all like that? I think many of us are like that. Anyway, let's talk about this particular story, Tapestried Chamber, published in 1829, published in the Keepsake, and it was one of 3 stories. So it's later in his work, He's writing to pay off his debt at this time. The elegant annual, the Keepsake, was designed as a Christmas gift book. What I'm saying is, he knows what he's not a businessman, but he's working for a living, and he knows what sells. He's not stupid, and so this book, The Keepsake, was sumptuous in its illustrations aimed at middle and upper class readers with a taste for sentiment, romance, and the gently macabre. The printer publisher of it, I think it was the publisher, it was a guy called Charles Heath, and he said to Scott, "I'll give you £800 to edit The Keepsake." But he, at that time, was overwhelmed with work. And there were 2 things. First of all, he probably didn't have the time to do it. But is he limiting his involvement in the Gothic, which is considered lowbrow? I don't know. However, he was paid £500, which is a lot of money for the 3 stories. And so that he had intended initially these 3 stories to go into a collection, Chronicles of the Canongate, but they were rejected by his publisher, Robert Cadell. So he then offered them to Charles Heath and got £500 for them. So interesting that, isn't it? So let's talk about the story itself. It's a very simple story. So you've got General Woodville, the General, General Browne, isn't he, I think, goes to see Lord Woodville, his old mate, who was his fag at school, which is his servant. He sees his lovely castle, and and it turns out, so he goes there. And we know now from afterwards that the Lord, who again, like Scott, like many gentlemen of the mid-Victorian, poo-pooed the supernatural, and although it had a family history of being haunted and locked up, no, this is nonsense. I'm going to put the General, who's brave as a lion, and he's going to prove it all wrong, and I'm going to be able to use the room. And if I put anybody else who's a bit of a milksop in there, they'll probably chicken out and run out in the middle of the night. So the General's just a man, but I'm not going to tell him because I don't want to kind of set him up. So it's actually a scientific experiment, really. It's not double blind, it's blind, not double blind, because the Lord, if it was double blind, the Lord himself wouldn't know which chamber the man had gone into. And there's no control group, so okay, it's not really an experiment, but it's a kind of experiment. So it's short, isn't it? All it is he sees this horrible thing. It's later confirmed who it was later on, but it's left at that. There's no resolution, no justice, no exorcism. The room is sealed, the past once again locked away. Is this saying something about his inherent conservatism, which is ultimately we test these things in the modern world, but we find out that we've just wasted our time and we've messed around with things that the past already told us we shouldn't have messed around with, and so just lock it up again. So it is Gothic, ancestral. It's the ancestor of Lord Woodville, so that's a very Gothic theme. The castle, the ghost. It's so Gothic, isn't it? And however, we also need to spot the growth of the separate genre of the ghost story, which arises from, remember, Gothic books, not all of them, but a lot of them were really long. And they were sagas, and they went on. Whereas the ghost stories are much more distilled, and most ghost stories are short stories. Some people manage to extend them to a longer piece, but mainly they don't work well as longer pieces. I'm thinking of Michelle Paver with Dark Matter, which is great, and her other books, but they're pretty short. Susan Hill's book, The Woman in Black, is short. They're novellas. I mean, Return of the Screw, Beckoning Fair one, they're novellas, they're not long stories. And I think, so what we're seeing is Scott takes out the Gothic and is helping him giving birth to the child of the Gothic, which is the ghost story, as a separate form, a short form. It's not overdone though, is it? I mean, okay, the macabre woman who comes and he sees a horrid face and stuff like that. I think it's also interesting we don't know what this woman has done. We know she was vile and guilty of incest or something, but we don't get any details. I think possibly these days we would. So let's think about him again a bit deeper with his Gothicness. So as a young man, as we said, he was swept up in the German romantic craze. He translated Bürger and wrote ballads modelled on those of Goethe and Schiller particularly. He was German mad. He even says that in his notes at those dates. And then, but as he grows, he develops the ability to view the Gothic not as a worldview, but as a set of literary effects. He can just deploy them, the tropes. He knows when to put them in, and he can also make fun of them in other places. In his published writings, but also he's published not necessarily his fiction, but what we know about what he said. Actually, he is sceptical and mocking even. But and in 1830, just before he died, he wrote a piece called Letters on Demonology and Witchcraft, 1830, and he strikes a tone of genial scepticism. Ghosts, witches, and second sight are treated as cultural curiosities, remnants of an irrational past, to be anatomized, not revived. So this is what I was saying about the Scottish Enlightenment, but the scientific worldview that's come down from that. It's very much part of that. But as I've said before, Scott he's split. He's a dichotomy. He's split. There is part of him that kind of loves this stuff, and then there's the respectable part of him that poo-poos it. So he also, in personal correspondence, described mesmerism and magnetism as humbug, and he spoke with wry disdain of those who trafficked in spiritualist fads. Now, he never fully renounces the Gothic. Charles Maturin wrote Melmoth the Wanderer, again, another book you could kill somebody with by dropping it on them. And 1820, he thought Maturin was brilliant, an Irish writer. He thought he was brilliant, but it was unfortunate he'd chosen the Gothic. So an edifying popular form, the Gothic, but he still sees Maturin's talent as a writer. So now we need to think about what he's doing in this story. If he thinks this is all nonsense, why is he writing about it? Why does he put this grotesque woman in? He thinks it's all humbug, apparently. I think it's a bit more complex than that, but certainly his public face was to say it was all humbug and the ghosts and monsters. But so why is he doing it? Is it a cynical writer? The man needs to make some money and he goes, this sells, I'm going to write this. Writing to market, they call it. You look at what sells. So if what the world wants is slightly mucky alpha werewolf billionaire, so the werewolf is both a billionaire and a werewolf, and he rips his shirt, and so the cover has to have a ripped shirt with abs of a werewolf, and that is going to sell. I'm guaranteed you're going to sell. I would struggle to write that. Is Scott doing that? I don't know. Is it a cynical use of the Gothic because it sells, or is he? This is a Scottish Protestant, a child of the Enlightenment. But he's also a lover of Highland culture. He reveres the past for its own sake, but he's quite happy to romanticise it. What are they? I think probably the truth of it is, I'm not sure that he actually, despite what he says about ghosts, I'm not sure he actually gives up on them. You could argue with me, I'm sure some of you will. So, and also the Gothic ghost, of course, is one that has a meaning, and this one doesn't really have a meaning. And why the general? And people disagree with this as well, but I'm convinced of it. Writers, when they write, end up putting more into their stories than they themselves know. Because when you are composing a story, where does all that stuff come from? Because it tends to just flow. It's almost like it's channeled. And then so it comes out, and then you don't know why it's doing these things. This is a really common thing for writers to say. Why do characters do what they do? Why did this happen? Who knows? It just came out. So it's like an inspiration from the unconscious, from an irrational part. And then you can use your knowledge of craft and skill to shape it. So the two parts of your brain are being involved, or your mind, or whatever it is, are being involved in that. And things will be written that you didn't know what they meant. And then somebody, an intelligent person, comes along and says, I think that's right. I think this is what you meant. And you go, oh my goodness, you're right. I see it now. And in a sense, it's like undergoing psychotherapy, because, the whole ethos of psychotherapy is it explains why you do certain things. So why do you always argue with older men? Because it's to do with your dad. And you're just replaying these things. And we know these things happen, even in less controversial senses. I talk about Bowlby's attachment theory. How do we form attachments? We don't consciously form an attachment, but yet there is an attachment with a certain pattern that has certain characteristics, and we repeat them. So the pattern of attachment we have to our primary caregivers, we will repeat that in life. That will become our template with our romantic partners, with our work partners, because this is how we understand. We've learned that. So my point about saying that is, things can be in your stories that you didn't, because the other view is there is nothing that we don't intend. Everything is under conscious control. That's just humbug. That's just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. So I'm making the case that there are things in this story that reflect Walter Scott and his view of the world, but that he did not necessarily deliberately. We can't ask him now unless we do it by a seance, which would be amusing and ironic. We can't ask him to say, did you mean this? And he'd go, yeah, of course I did. Yeah, of course I did. Like the way I put the ghost in because I knew it would sell. Maybe he did, but I think there's other things going on, So so all of that is to look at this pairing of the masculine general, and who stands for part of Scott. And this is a rational man. He's faced all sorts of things, and he can reason them down. He's not a man who's mastered by his passions. He can master his, he's control of himself. He is the epitome of the Enlightenment scientist warrior, if there is such a thing, who is in control. And this is, remember what I said before, the Enlightenment myth is that everything is knowable and everything is controllable because it's knowable. So if we only know how things work, we can control how things work, and that is the whole message behind the Enlightenment. Whereas the romantic view is the irrationalist, which says it is basically unknowable. This where we are and what's going on is unknowable. So in a sense, the general represents that, the domination of humanity, and not. I don't think it's an accident that he's a man. Yeah. Because it's a kind of seen as a masculine coded thing, this way of thinking. Whereas certainly in our there's nothing wrong with irrational thinking, by the way. I do it all the time. Is a feminine coded thing. So in a sense, this power that unmans him, that defeats him, is represented by a female figure. It's the irrational. And to jump on the bandwagon of my old mate Carl Jung, he talks about the undifferentiated stuff that is below us gets mixed up and it gets feeling tones. So a lot of this stuff is tainted with a sense of evil and a sense of evil, a scariness, and that's because it's undifferentiated. It's not because the feminine is evil, but because in a man who hasn't separated out those things inside himself. It's the opposite for women, actually, so Jung would say. But Jung actually, anyway, let's not get into that. So she represents the irrational female, which defeats him, interestingly. And so going back to Walter Scott, here we have this champion of the Enlightenment who poo-poos things and is hard-headed commercial. He's got all those virtues of doing the right thing, being responsible, working hard, driving your body and mind when it doesn't want to be driven. Those are the virtues that society espouses. And in the general, they are defeated by those things that society then pushed away. Ghosts, the irrational, the things that come from the past that we don't understand, all the stuff we don't understand. So I think it's a very simple story, but I think at its heart, that's what it's about. It reflects Walter Scott's own division within himself between the man he was proud to be and the irrational, potentially feminine part of himself, although that is a stretch, I get that. But theory would suggest that he wants to hide away. It's interesting, she is undifferentiated, isn't she? We don't even know what she did. Incest is really interesting, a crime of incest. That means something, but I haven't got time to work it out. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a good old story, and there's always lots to talk about, isn't there, afterwards? Whether you agree with me or not, because I'm not. I come to these conclusions, but they are always provisional. I'm always happy to be, and often what happens is people point out things in the notes like, oh yeah, that's right, I missed that. That's right. So it's all provisional. There we are. Bye bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?